My name is Rob Raven, for those who don't know me. I'm the Deputy Director of Research at MSDI, Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And before continuing, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we are gathered today and pay my respect to the elders past and present. Now, a very warm welcome to all of you for this first ever Monash Sustainable Development Lounge event. And I'm very pleased to see you all here today. And my job really is to be brief and short in this opening and to open up the event and hand over to our Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research, Rebecca Brown, for a short introduction as well, and then to our keynote speaker of today, Professor Derk Loorbach. But before I do so, I'd like to say a few words about the MSDI Affiliates Program. And so we established this program last year because we believe it will be a great way to help the university and MSDI to advance our ambitions in terms of programmatic, impact-oriented research for sustainable development. And achieving sustainable development is really a wicked problem, not one that is easily solved. And we cannot solve them in the silos that we all do our daily work in. So we need more systems-based thinking, systems-based approaches that aim to tackle these wicked problems through deep collaboration across our disciplines, areas of expertise, and in partnership with our societal partners in industry, in community, and in policy. And so through a series of events, as well as a range of other activities, we hope that the program can contribute to these university ambitions and to developing and nurturing our interdisciplinary relationships. And we also hope that it doesn't stay confined to the academic parts of the university. So we made a very deliberate choice to open up the affiliates program to professional staff as well as PhD students, because we think the university thrives because of everyone that's involved here, not just our academic staff. And so in fact, currently the affiliates program has around 150 members and representation from across all of the faculties in the university, as well as our international campuses in Malaysia and Indonesia. And I'm very much looking forward to further build this program with all of you together. And please feel free to come forward and say if you want to contribute or be involved in some ways. We're very happy to work with you and facilitate that. So now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our DVCR, Rebecca Brown. Rebecca doesn't need much of an introduction, I guess, in this context, but I would like to say that I'm deeply appreciative of the fact that you made time to come and speak with us here today. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. Anything to do with MSDI makes me feel very, very happy. Thank you, Rob, for that introduction. And I also wish to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the peoples of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and any Indigenous colleagues that are joining us here today. And any colleagues online, I also acknowledge the lands that you are coming from this morning. So today's a pretty special day. We have Professor Derk Loorbach joining us as our keynote speaker, and I'll introduce Derk in just a moment. But I am really delighted to welcome you all to the inaugural Monash Sustainable Development Institute Affiliate Program. And I congratulate Professor Tony Capon and Professor John Thwaites and Rob. Of course, this is a really big moment, and this is something that the Institute has wanted to do for quite some time. So this is really significant. The affiliate program supports MSDI's ambition to facilitate a university-wide approach, bringing about a transdisciplinary community working on sustainable development and focused on translating research and education for real-world change, and just so important in our sector at this time. It's perfect too for us as an overall university because our strategy, Impact 2030, sets out our research and education agenda to address three key challenges of our age: climate change, geopolitical security, and thriving communities. And as many of you here know, we have 90,000 students, 18,000 staff. We have 9 campuses across 6 countries. So we're large, we're complex. It won't be long before we've got 500,000 alumni. And our alumni are from 170 countries, and many of them have got really quite influential roles across the Indo-Pacific. So the opportunity for us as an institution to be influential, to have impact, and to really make sure that our education and research serves important social and planetary purposes is there. We have the opportunity to be really impactful. We're not script. So these really complex challenges demand transformation, and I'm speaking to the converted here, across every sector that we have. So we need to continue to build and facilitate deep connections and partnerships. And this is the value for everyone here to be an affiliate of MSDI. It's the opportunity to work across campuses, to work across sectors, and to help deepen our influence with business, government, philanthropic organisations and communities. And this is why the agenda of MSDI and the affiliates program that's been launched today is just so important. Universities play a critical role in future building, and we want Monash to be really at the forefront of that as vital hubs of research and education, and addressing really, really important and complex problems. We're the sector that can do it, and we are the sector that have the mandate to do that. So one of the ways we do that is through our mission-orientated approaches, crowding in partners, people, organisations committed to common missions in order to create expanded agendas to solve global challenges. So that means we need to think and act in expanded ways, sometimes new and different ways to what we have previously. And in my opinion, MSDI is an example in the higher education sector that really is a front runner in this emerging shift in our sector, in academia, towards more engaged, transformative, interdisciplinary work. Programs such as Fire to Flourish, Climate Works, Behaviour Work, the Citteram River Project, RISE, all embody this philosophy and this approach and are figuring out how to do it. So we have an opportunity today to hear from a global leader in this space, Professor Derk Loorbach, who I've had the pleasure to work closely with over a number of years. So I've personally known Derk for well over 15 years. I had only, I think I was about 4 or 5 years out of my PhD in the social sciences, actually it was in environmental sociology. And I was really struggling, thinking, how do we put this into practice? And I was coming up with all these conceptual models, and because I'm originally trained as an engineer, and I just felt, you know, the conceptual frameworks of the social sciences and the conceptual frameworks of the applied physical sciences, I just could not bring them together. They were just antitheses to each other. And then I read all these papers written by Professor Derk Loorbach on transition management and went, oh my God, someone else has already solved it. My career is over. But so I made it my business to go and meet with Derk. And I was still having a bit of imposter syndrome because he was a real social scientist and I was only really half of one. And it was really interesting interacting with Derk. He helped me realise just how powerful it was to be so trained in the physical sciences and deeply trained in the social sciences. He helped me understand that I could do so much with that. We've done some research projects together. We've had some PhD students together, and we've had this common ambition and common agenda around how can the higher education sector serve the world in more catalytic ways. It's great. We still need members of our sector to sit back and observe and comment. We need that. We both agree on that. But we also need parts of our sector and parts of our scholarly community to jump in to the really deep, hard, tricky, complex end and be brave and ask these really, really hard questions and try and come up with solutions. So I've always found Derk's work, Derk's leadership and what he stands for truly inspiring. So Professor Loorbach is joining us from the Design Impact Transition Platform, which seeks to apply transition management to accelerate the university transitions at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Today, he will share his thinking on a really critical subject for us in the higher education sector, radical transitions through transformative research. We are living in a time when our inability to achieve consensus or structural change around problems, deep, complex problems like climate change, is increasingly critical. Professor Loorbach is asking really interesting and important questions about how we can look beyond our own current models and change course while we have the opportunity to do so, and how we could evolve worldwide transformative research systems. So today is not only an opportunity to deepen our understanding and thinking in this space, but it's also to build connections, because as I know, Monash and Erasmus University in Rotterdam have so many shared interests, especially through MSDI and Derk's unit, DIT. So please make the most of today, make connections, feel free to be inspired and challenged and ignite engaging conversations, push boundaries and ask really provocative questions. Now, the reason why I'm emphasising this, if we were in Rotterdam right now, it would be a very different kind of tone. We're more polite here, as we've discussed, Derk, and then we go in for the bang of the really hard question, making it look really polite. When you're sitting in the Netherlands, it's a lot more. So you might have to encourage some. Yeah, encourage some. So as I said, ask the question, challenge. Derk is up for it. He does it every day in his environment. So thank you, everyone. And now please welcome Professor Derk.
Yes, good morning. I cannot help myself anyway. I'm Dutch and direct, so thanks for those nice words and warm welcome, Rebecca, Rob. Thanks for having me. And I've been looking forward to this a lot because I've been following Rebecca, well, as she explained, for 15 years already, and MSDI as well. And we took a lot of inspiration from it, and we used MSDI, you, also as a leverage within our university to get things moving a bit. So I'll try and come back to that. Okay, I see the font. What I want to share with you this morning is basically how our thinking in the Netherlands, but also as part of the broader transitions research community, evolved over the last 10, 15 years to think about what the short-term future holds and needs. And I will address the research system, but also how the institutions work. And I speak to you from a European context. I come from a very tiny country. It's called the Netherlands. It's below sea level. It has a very fossil-intensive industry. It has a food system that is globally leading, but it also destroys our living environment. Most of the people crowd together in cities that are very compact. We do a lot of cycling. And the reason why I say this is that a lot of the global sustainability problems hit us first because we are so compact and dense and we have such little space. And I know not a lot from Australia, but I know that you have a lot of space. so you might also have a lot of time to ignore the kind of problems that are coming our way. You can still push them out of sight to some extent. You might see us as the canary in the coal mine, because I think we are now experiencing in the Netherlands what the relatively short-term future might hold for the rest of the world. I'm speaking here on with two affiliations. One was already introduced by Rebecca. It's an attempt, much like MSDI, at our university to transform our university, and the other is a group I lead. It's called Drift. We're officially a social enterprise of the university, but we're a bunch of action activist researchers that have been doing this transformative research for the last 20 years. And Rebecca already referred to the need for transformation, but the fundament of our work is basically the thought, the hypothesis, you might say, around the inevitability of transitions. I will get to the normative part and the need for transformation later, but the starting point for much of our work is basically this analysis. And these are graphs from the IPCC and IPBES, the planetary boundaries framework on the right. On the left, you see our carbon emissions, and plotted upon it are our attempts through policy to address climate change. But we know, obviously, of course, I assume that biodiversity loss in a broader sense, but the destruction of our living world is kind of a serious problem. Scientists indicate it with red colors. So you see that there's a problem. But the underlying question is really, why is it not possible, or why are we failing to address these problems while research evidently shows that it is a problem? And we as humans also can rationally understand these are problems. They drive us towards an existential problem if it isn't here already. So the underlying question is, why aren't we able to use the knowledge that we have and translate it into actions that actually change course? The other point, and that is also what academics have shown us, starting with the Club of Rome 50 years ago, that if this continues, we will see a non-linear collapse, if we aren't seeing it already. And these are some pictures from my hometown, Rotterdam. Below sea level, we have a big fossil port. It's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in Europe. We also have a lot of socio-economic problems in our cities. Top right is a picture from colleagues on health inequalities, climate vulnerability, poverty. We started to see the same kind of pattern that we see in the environmental problems at the local scale in socio-economic problems. Researchers that study the problems, they map health inequalities, they count how many people are homeless or are living in poverty. We measure the air quality, we identify health impacts, and then we create all sorts of policy programs to deal with that. But somehow there isn't a way to structurally address it. Sorry for the fonts there. And the concept that we use to start explaining why things are not changing is regime. It's a bit of a complex term. It's used in a lot of different disciplines, but basically it refers to the shared ways of thinking, doing, and organizing that we develop as humans in a setting where we are together. It can be a university, it can be space, a neighborhood, a city, but it can also be a sector. And basically, a regime refers to what we all consider as normal. This is the context that we work in, that we live in. This is how it is. And there's a lot of deep social science and social concepts behind it. Culture, thinking refers to discourse, to values, shared norms, words. Structures can refer to physical infrastructures, but also to the economic incentives, the legal rules. and practices to our behavior. Think of, for example, the mobility system. I've experienced it again this morning. You have a lot of space, so you live far apart, so you need to build roads. So you all buy a car, and you drive your car, and then you create traffic jams. So probably you need more roads, and you need more parking spaces, and then you're going to regulate that because it needs to be safe. So you get all sorts of things for that, and you need money to build it. So you get toll booths, and this is how sort of a regime grows gradually. It's often the outcome of a historical process, and historians will always explain a regime as a solution to a problem that we experienced in the past. The problem is that regimes also come with path dependency. It's an economic term, but it basically means it is a context from which it's hard to escape. So we're all living in this context. We drive our car because we have to, because we cannot do it in another way. But we've also invested in it. We've built our careers maybe in that context. We've put our money there. We've created institutions that also develop an inertia. But what we also started to see is that the problem-solving mechanisms within our society have also an inbuilt focus towards supporting path dependency. And you could say that the way policy works, but also the way that management works in a more private or business-oriented environment, but also the knowledge system are all geared towards improving within the context of an existing regime. And I say it in a rather indirect way, but basically it means we identify problems, we isolate them, or we separate them, or we cut them up in measurable or quantifiable specific problems. We identify solutions, we negotiate, we make plans, we formulate all sorts of agreements, we create what we refer to as the implementation illusion. We talk a lot, at least in the Netherlands, and we make a plan and a commitment and set targets, and that creates the illusion that somewhere in the future someone will actually do all that. The other 2 points really relate to how we think about progress. It's about managing innovation and implementing innovation in this context. And it becomes harder and harder to imagine anything else than the existing regime. Historically, how we have created our living environment is an anomaly or a coincidence, you might say. But for us in everyday life, it's impossible to imagine it to be anything else. And then you get this. So you get an increasing wedge between sort of the understanding of the problems in the future. You get a response in the system to try to address these problems that are basically created by the regimes themselves, and we try to solve them through optimization and innovation. And I'm not against technological innovation, but history really doesn't provide a lot of arguments to suggest that we can actually innovate our way out of the sustainability problem in a technological sense. And now I take you to the Netherlands because in the last couple of months, 2 things happened. One is there is a growing societal concern about climate change and biodiversity, and people glue themselves to highways, asking for an end of fossil subsidies, as they call it. So all sorts of historical financial regulations that were put in place to stimulate consumption and production based on fossil resources. That's the official term, fossil subsidies. Actually with a lot of success. So within a year, from a small-scale activism, it moved into parliament and it became accepted policy. And then just before I came here, we had elections. I cannot say anything other than a racist, xenophobic, extreme right-wing politician became the biggest in Parliament. It was a shock to the political system, to mainstream politics, and I know you have your fair share of let's say, extreme politics here as well. But for the Netherlands, a moderate country, this is quite something, and we have to see what the fallout is. But I can see it as nothing else than it's a revolt of angry citizens that are fed up with the existing political system that's not addressing the fundamental needs. And I think there's a truth to that. They blame the wrong people. They blame immigrants, except for instead of the existing political parties. But still, and it's a sign of transition. It's a sign of destabilization. And this is the main point in the first part I wanted to make, that to understand transformative change, we need to understand unsustainability, our collective inability to address these persistent problems while we know that the pressure for change is increasing. This is an old model, but the basics are these societal regimes that we've developed, and their path dependency is unable to address the changing needs from the context. So if we want to release that pressure, we need to somehow anticipate the disruption ahead. There's numerous examples of transitions in the past, so historians study them. Rob knows it very well. There are hundreds of historical examples in which often technological innovation was very important. And if we combine those historical examples with complexity science, you get this kind of a picture. The idea that transitions are processes where these societal regimes that we have built, we keep optimizing them because we don't know how to escape it. But at the same time, our context changes. So that's the background of this picture. But there's also always individuals, whether they're academics that come up with new inventions, engineers, social entrepreneurs, activists, people come up with alternatives, and they might say, well, I'm going to ride my bike, or I'm going to change my diet, or I come up with a new invention. And at first, it might be really alternative, but as the pressure increases, these regimes might start to destabilize. Actors within the regime start to become uncomfortable, and that might lead to a feeling of chaos, and ultimately things dissolve or break down. Looking backwards, we can see a transition as a story from A to B. So there's emergence, there's an alternative narrative, there was an old system and it was replaced by a new system. But the fundamental point now is that we are in the midst, or we are in the beginning, or we have no clue where we are. So the Dutch elections, for example, you might say the Geert Wilders, that's his name, transition. He was part of the political establishment 20 years ago when it was still relatively stable, and he became very extreme right, radical, and he was marginalized and blocked out. But as the regime was unable to renew itself, society changed, more pressure increased, he got more followers, he got more competition, and right now we might interpret the Dutch election as a shift through chaos towards institutionalization. We have no idea. So we can talk about sustainability transitions, but it's all about, on the one hand, sense making, but it's also about anticipating what might be ahead and thinking about what this means for us. And I would like to have in the conversation also an exchange on whether there are signs of destabilization here, or where you are in transition, what that would mean. So how we took this idea is, if we anticipate transformative changes and disruptions ahead, it also means that there is future momentum to shift towards a more just and sustainable future in a relatively rapid way. But it will come with a lot of turbulence, because fundamentally transitions are processes of big turmoil. And in this process, obviously, there's a lot of resistance to change from citizens, but also from actors that have something to lose within the existing regime. So the logic that we started to develop this transition management idea is to take this idea of transition to engage with whatever regime that we engage with. We might do a neighborhood project, we might do something in a sector, we might do something in an organization. Sort of put that regime in a broader perspective, look at the systemic dynamics together with actors involved in the regime, and then go through social learning processes. So basically, what we try to do and what we mean with transformative research is sort of a sense making while these transitions are emerging. And we develop all sorts of tools and instruments. So you can, you can use whatever kind of tools and tricks, whether it's scenarios, visioning, modeling, experimentation, pilots. But what I want to stress is the underlying logic. So what we try to do, and we work a lot with industries, with government, with companies, with other academics, to try to translate this idea of transition into action. And basically what we refer to as 1.0 is the context within which we say, well, there's a relatively stable regime. There are some indications that there's a problem in the longer term future. And we want to maybe create what we call transition arenas. So spaces for individuals to come together to make sense of what is happening. The idea behind it is based on social learning. If you take people out of their context, bring them together in a sequence of steps, have them reflect on transition dynamics and the desired transition, they start to internalize an outside-in view. And it will change their behavior in their daily context. And a very quick example of it is a process which is really on my mind, because we're now finishing it, but we had 5 meetings with people from the finance system in the Netherlands. They are not so much front runners as they were like the highest level, the leadership of the big banks, pension funds, the ministry, and so on. And we had a transition dialogue, which was quite interesting because it was, on one hand, on financing transitions. That is what they really wanted to talk about, but we steered it towards the transition in the finance system. And all these individuals were quite engaged with sustainability. They also want to invest in sustainability, but through this process of reflection, they started to understand that the logic of the finance system itself might be the bigger problem, and might also ultimately lead to a transformative change in the finance system. So in short, what they concluded to some extent was that there's too much money in the Netherlands. We have a big pile of money, and the group was responsible for 1.5 trillion euros. I don't know what it translates to Australian dollars, but a lot of money. And the logic of money, even when you invest it in sustainability, is that it needs to generate more money. It needs to generate return on investment, and that return on investment basically means more money is created. And that money needs to come from somewhere. So either someone creates debt or you sell a piece of nature. So basically, this underlying logic drives inequality because money accumulates where money is. But it also is driving these unsustainability problems. And they started to sort of reflect on the historic transition. So we created a narrative that there was a time up till the 70s where there was still a balance in the system. We talk about natural, social, and financial capital. And there was a historic transition where the finance system was decoupled from the real economy. It's extracted all this value. It created this money pile by extracting value from nature and the social context. And then, so far so good. But where we were failed in this transition arena was that ultimately they thought they could just stabilize the pie. So the vast majority of the participants said, "Okay, we're going for green investment, and we will manage." While a smaller segment of the group was more radical and said, "We need to shrink the money pile and basically invest all the money in sustainable infrastructures." I'm taking too long on this issue, but it's we can maybe pick it up if that's interesting. So the logic that evolved, where we say, okay, we do a lot of these transition arenas at different skills. They created narrative, they create these networks, but gradually we started to see also societal context change. At least in the Netherlands, in different sectors, real destabilization occurred. Larger actors within the regime started to open up. More alternatives emerged. And in that context, we started to work with transition policy mixes. Because we could actually start to address phase out. And within different ministries, we started to have conversations about phase out of coal-fired power plants, subsidizing fossil fuels, for example, but also more and more about the more evolutionary or incremental side of transitions, which is really about changing the rules of the game. So the policy mix in transitions is basically how are we going to take what's already there and mainstream it? How are we going to take the existing structures, cultures, and practices and adapt them to that new desired context? And how are we going to manage the decline? So the phase out, giving the 5-minute sign. So this is a picture from a big project that we did in our city in Rotterdam. It involved some 150 to 200 organizations and actors. We created a local vision for a city without private cars. It was sort of a thought experiment. So we took the top right as a starting point, identified all sorts of social practices and transformative innovation that happened. A lot of the policy makers, they took it into a policy change, and we put a lot of phase out on the agenda. Still sort of mostly about empowering the alternatives and creating space within the policy discourse. It led to a shift in road regulations, in new commitments to prioritizing cycling and walking, a lot of social experimentation. Still, there's a lot of cars in the city. But what we are arriving now in the Netherlands is, especially with these elections, is the 3.0 phase. This is where our experimental agenda is. And by now, we know quite clearly where we need to go. At least in the Netherlands, we say we need to shift towards an economic model that is still providing human needs. So we still want to move, and we want to have energy, food, water, and so on. But we want to do that with as little space, energy, resources as possible, and give more people access and make it affordable. So one of the attempts we're doing, and this is sort of the experimental engaged research that we're doing, is trying to think about how can we take all the practices that that are already there, that we know are within that nature positive economy. So we see different food systems, we see different mobility systems, energy systems, much like you're trying to experiment here, but we see them at a smaller scale, but they are not recognized from within the regime, and they are also threatening, because they are about local value, they are not so extractive, they don't create problems for policymakers to solve. I will share the slide. So what we're organizing now is transition ateliers. I don't know if that's an English term, transition design labs or something like that, where we bring together people that already do it, with academics, with artists and designers, and with policymakers. And basically, we try to really think through what would it look like, a city without private cars. And we're now actually doing it for Rotterdam, because that requires a cooperative governance model. It requires a different type of infrastructure. It requires a way to get people appreciate or interact with the system. It needs a business model. It needs a legal structure. So it requires institutional design, but we also want to tell the story. We want to make sure how it, what it looks like. So the last minute, I want to spend on what this logic means, because how we try to work in our transition community in the Netherlands creates a lot of friction with the existing knowledge system. We want to challenge it, but we also want to transform it. And this platform I'm leading is an attempt to do what I described as a way to also transform the institute. And obviously this is what a university does: research, education, and engagement. But for us, they are all one. And I hope I explained that through my story. So for me, transformative research is constantly combining knowledge development, knowledge co-production in and with practice, with a process of social learning in an engaged way. So that almost everything becomes learning, you might say. And one of the experiments that challenges our university, at least, is this master program on transitions that we developed. We developed it as a sort of educational experiment. It's based on transformative learning, on this learning journey that you see throughout the course. We have two tracks running through the whole year, which are about reflexivity and intervision and reflecting on the learning process. And the content is on transitions and sustainability. But we also developed it as a new model. So it's like a joint venture between different groups at campus that doesn't really fit the existing structures. The financial model is different, but it also is based on graduating on an intervention. And the idea is that by developing this master, we challenge the university structure, but we also create communities of students and teachers that then together work also in these design or transition ateliers. I have to end here. The story that I want to share, and I hope became clear, is that, and I hope to hear whether that's the case or not, that we are moving in the same kind of direction, that these global problems that are also local, that require a completely different form of engagement that we might refer to as transformative education, transformative research, and that requires a new type of regime. So we need to think about the change of the academic regime, the university transition, and we can only think about it while doing it. So going consciously and collaboratively through this process of experimentation, learning, envisioning, backcasting is the process of transformation, and I hope we can walk in this together. Thanks so much for your attention.
Fantastic, Dirk, and you can actually stay up on the stage. Maybe you want to do the full circle and go up on the. Thanks for that fantastic presentation. We have some Q&A time now. We start with an initial contribution from Liam Smith, who is the Director of Behavioral Works in MSDI. I should say that we also plan to have Professor Sarah Pink from the Emerging Technologies Lab here present as well, but unfortunately she was not well today, so she couldn't she couldn't make it. But we'll have some time. Liam, I'm going to give first the floor to you to give some comments to Derk, and then maybe Derk, you can give a brief response to Liam as well, and then we open up for any questions to finish around 11 on this particular session.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Derk, for your presentation. I guess my task is to just have some reflections, and I'm going to start with some reflections from my own discipline. So I'm a behavioural scientist and lead a research group called Behaviours Australia. Many of you will know us, based in the Sustainable Development Institute. And it's appropriate that Rebecca's here, actually, because I remember having this discussion with Rebecca maybe about 10 years ago about transitions theory and how behavioural science not necessarily meshed well with it. And to use some of the language used in your presentation, a lot of behavioural science is around optimisation. It's around persuasion, it's around coaching, it's around nudging, and these sorts of approaches that encourage people to act as free agents within a system. And if you think about a system being constructed of structures and agency, or in a classic sort of sociological way, if people can act as free agents, then largely there's nothing wrong with the structure. And so in many ways you embed it and you reinforce it and you make it and you validate it, because we can act freely within it. We can bring ourselves out of poverty. We can commute to and from work not in the car. We can do all those things. They're all possible. The system doesn't necessarily enable it, but we can do those things. And it does lead us sort of to reinforce the fact that we have agency. So that kind of existential crisis, if you like, from a behaviour change perspective, sort of has led a lot of our thinking over recent years. And the appointment of Rob Raven into the Institute recently also has helped that. Sorry, there you go. has sort of reinforced that idea that that we need to think about transitions as behavioural scientists. And so when I think about some of what you've presented and what I've heard from Rob and Rebecca beforehand, I think about what role could behavioural science play in order to try and prevent this reinforcement of systems and try and get change. And I think it's actually really important that we do, because actually a lot of what I see you talking about and how sociologists and similar sort of thinkers is too slow for us. The urgency is now. It's not, these transitions, when you talk about radical change, I'm imagining that's 10 or 15 or 20 years, not, 10 days, right? So we think in different timescales. And so, and we're impatient, I think it's probably fair to say, of our discipline. So what can we contribute that then helps us try and drive transitions in a way that helps get to that radical change that we need in a faster way? And it sort of led us to thinking about a few things. The first is really about the need for policy support. So new policies or new institutions, particularly in Australia, and one of my tasks is to relate this to Australia, require support. They require typically popular support. If you put in something in place in a place of compulsory voting that's really radical and different, you can potentially lead to being unelected very quickly. If it disadvantages some people, and inevitably change does disadvantage some people. And so it's very easy to cast a narrative that says we don't want to have change that disadvantages people. So I think that there's a need to bring behavioural science to help address that issue. So in thinking about what behaviours we might do, so obviously policy support is one of the key ones. How do we get policy support? And the psychologist Paul Stern talks about policy support as being a behaviour. Now, how that manifests, maybe it's in voting or maybe it's in other ways, advocacy or donations or the like, but he sees that as a behaviour. And I think that's something that our discipline ought to do and encourage. Another sort of way we think about helping speed transitions is to think about the particular behaviours that we might want to target. I mentioned policy support, but one of the things I've learned from Rob is that the need for transitions, the hard part of transitions is decommissioning what you're currently doing, not actually, the ideation of the new is kind of like the easy and fun part, but the hard part is stopping what you are currently doing. And so I think about behavioural science, is it that we need to think about what's the category of decommissioning behaviours that we want to encourage and foster? And if you think about, say, native forest logging or to prevent that, well, what do the loggers do instead? How do we get behaviour change in them to give them an alternate pathway that isn't that? And so I guess, but the one other thing that how I think behavioural science can potentially help is to use behaviour change approaches as a diagnostic of systems. And I know that there's the low waste CRC, low waste living CRC, I think it's called, that have done, taken a group of people who are super motivated to live with low waste. I imagine similar to some of the examples you gave, Dirk, and said, okay, off you go, try and choose the behaviours you want to do, and we'll evaluate and touch base with you and see how you went. So they've taken motivation out of the equation. These people are motivated. And when they talk to them at the end, most of them haven't been able to do low waste living. Why? And they're able to explain the reasons why these policies are in place, the incentives are wrong. And so it's kind of like using behavioural science as a diagnostic of system issues in trying to understand, well, where are the pushbacks? What prevents the motivated, let alone the unmotivated? We have to get to them later on. But what prevents the motivated from doing what they want to do? So that's a few reflections, I guess, in terms of my own discipline of behavioural science. It's probably some reflections in terms of the Australian context. It's a little bit different. I might just end with one example. I was in a forum maybe 4 or 5 years ago where we had a whole lot of key decision makers, former politicians, former chief of staff for politicians, former leaders in their fields under Chatham House rules, and we floated the idea of a new way of pricing transport, how you move around. And the idea was called transport network pricing. Basically, you pay more for how far you travel, when you travel, and where you travel. So if you're going to travel a long way into the city at peak time, you're going to pay more, regardless of whether that's train or tram or bus or car or whatever. It doesn't matter. Just how far you travel, you pay more. Radical, fairly radical anyway in the Australian context, and some good evidence for these systems, this approach working in some other countries. We ran a forum where we had these decision makers and we toyed the idea of, how would this work? How would we get it up? How would we, would it be supported, and what would need to happen to support it? And I guess there were two key lessons from it. The first was that none of the decision makers read the briefing document really, which had all the really good evidence to show it worked. But the second one really was just how incredibly clever the political system in Australia was about bringing a new idea down, how to go about preventing a policy from happening. And it was remarkable to see how easy, in particular one former chief of staff to a premier, was able to articulate in a 5-point plan of how we'd bring the policy down. And that nature is true here. I think it's perhaps it's true in all politics, but with compulsory voting, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to get things through.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Liam, for opening up that conversation. And Dirk, I'm going to say you have about 2 minutes to solve all the issues that Liam put on the table. But I want to make sure that we've got some time for people to also raise additional questions. We do have some extra time after the coffee break as well to have some more conversations around the table. So don't worry, you'll get to talk about what you want to talk about. But we first want to give Dirk an initial response.
Yeah. I'll give most of my time to the audience, but maybe picking out one point, because I think you make a lot of excellent points. One thing I want to stress is how political transitions are. So you talk a lot about informing policymakers or engaging them. I think the regime and actors within the regime that represent the regime, which are obviously also policymakers, by definition, will try to go for incremental, gradual optimization. And that makes the work of transformative research also fundamentally normative, because it is two things. It challenges the status quo and the extent to which it can be sustainably prolonged. And second, it explores in an open way, but in a backcasting way, alternative directions to arrive at a just and sustainable alternative. But that political thing and that sort of radical thinking on the long term and transformative action on the short term is what connects the time gap that you refer to, but it also makes it distinctly different than just an incremental mapping of what sustainable behaviors are and how we can improve it. Because it starts with questioning the context and then trying to identify, okay, where are people, in spite of that context, still capable of doing it? But then using sort of the failed attempts as a diagnosis tool and how to move on from it, I think we can have a conversation. But for us, in the Dutch context, it is the political nature of doing transformative work that I cannot stress enough, because before you know it, you will end up being sort of still supporting an incremental process of making the unsustainable sustainable.
Thank you, Dirk. So happy for anyone to raise your hand, and if you would like to make a comment or a question, this is the time. Yeah, someone in the front.
This is going to sound very simple in the context of your elegant presentation, but I see it as relatively simple. To me, the biggest problem is selfishness. Full stop. To unpack it a little bit, I'm a baby boomer. My generation traditionally were the largest voting bloc in Australia. We enjoyed free education when we were young. We enjoyed secure employment, and we enjoyed housing we could afford to buy. And my children have none of those things. And my generation has deliberately screwed them by resisting any move to change tax regimes and all the other things that could take that forward. It's essentially blatant selfishness. Fixed in with that is the power of the status quo, which has just been touched upon. It's very, very hard to shift the status quo because all the people in it. I think Machiavelli commented on this about 5 centuries ago. And then you have stupidity. Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, all of the other populists, because they can say, make America great again, and all the dumb people say, that sounds really good. And because they're unhappy now, they vote for something else without any idea what the something else looks like. And I think about this every day, and I have absolutely no idea how we're going to fix it.
Dirk, a question around future generations and past generations and intergenerational challenges.
Well, you should have given the presentation. It's an excellent summary. Selfishness and stupidity. And it's basically also my sentiment in the Dutch elections. But there's sort of an unholy alliance between the frustrated people that suffer the effect of stagnation, deliberate stagnation for years, and the people that cause the stagnation, that are using the votes to keep the stagnation going. There's also a deeper level, also within the finance project that I referred to. It became more and more obvious that there's quite some people at higher level positions that are sort of incapable on a deeper fundamental level of empathy with the future and others. So then I come with my comments and sustainability, and then they just cannot think long term back or outside in. So yeah, our answer so far has been find the people that do and empower them and build the alternative, and then it becomes attractive. What we see now is that we can do that, but then there is the resistance to change, and then there's the inability to understand it that are the biggest barriers. So I would like to discuss further how that can be addressed.
Would you like to get a brief response?
Not really. I probably have a little more faith in humanity than that, but yeah. Look, there certainly are things that our former Prime Minister once said, always back self-interest, at least it's trying, and I think that's probably fair to say, particularly of the baby boomers who engage in what they call drawbridge politics, where they put down the bridge and let the policy go through and they pull it back up again.
I still have faith in people, but I also see from a transition perspective that this selfishness or individual orientation is also something that has been created by the context that we live in. So it has been the outcome of a historical process where also for good reasons we've been turned into consumers. And are stimulated to pursue our individual interests. And that has stimulated societal progress and economic growth, but it also has come at a price, and we now need to change the context.
Got another question over there?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for an amazing talk and very inspirational. I wanted to talk a little bit just about health systems and how we can transition health systems to make them more sustainable and more equitable. And as a designer, I was very impressed by the yellow diagram that leads us to transitional futures. And I guess a little concern that we have to go through chaos in order to rebuild. And I just wonder how we can transition health systems without them having to go through chaos, which is not necessarily good for workforce or patients, in order to have more sustainable and equitable health systems, and whether you have any examples or advice on that work.
So I started this work 20 years ago as a naive, still a bit younger guy, thinking about, okay, this is inevitable. Some level of chaos is inevitable. That's also what we learn from historical cases, from complexity sciences. But let's try to anticipate it and make it as smooth as possible. But that was underestimating all the forces that resist change, both the vested interest and all the ingrained path dependencies in our behaviors or in our routines and so on. Second, chaos is a relative notion, so it's experienced chaos. So in hindsight, we can see transitions that escalated into civil wars or complete collapse of sectors, or transitions that were relatively smooth and only the affected industries. We transitioned in the Netherlands from coal to gas. It was chaos for some parts of the economy, but that could be managed, and it was relatively small scale. So that inherently, people will feel disempowered or losing control when they're faced with the uncertainties of a shifting context. I've come back from the idea that we need to manage that. I think to some extent we need to create chaos and instill doubt in the people that are in charge and think they're in control and that they can manage. The other side of chaos is emergence, and is the sort of the feeling that people get when they see something new is coming. And what we try to do is combine those emotions, and we actually work now a lot with design communities because they can actually work with that much better than us social scientists that produce reports, because it's about experience and developing a sense of comfort in this liminal phase of letting go.
Thanks, Dirk. I'm going to take one more question by Andrea.
Oh, thank you. Hi, so my question is a little bit more practical. I was following on social media last May the Occupy and Fossil, the student groups, mainly in the Netherlands, occupying their universities and demanding change. So I wonder, in design impact transition and broadly at your university, how do you engage with that student action? Because going back to what Liam was saying, they want action now, they want changes now, and normally the responses they're getting from the academic boards are that they're working on it. They require a lot of dialogue and figuring things out. So yeah, thoughts, and also how you're engaging with them.
There's a whole story behind it. We're organizing now dialogues, so they don't like it. I actually knew quite some people that were involved in the occupation. What happened the firfirst time they occupied, I was there, I attended also with colleagues. and they were making soup and singing Kumbaya kind of songs in one of the buildings in the hallway. But then our board sent in the military police and evacuated them violently, and that escalated. So immediately we went to social media and we made a statement, and some 500 colleagues then supported a letter of support for the students, not necessarily on their agenda, but on what happened. And this happened on a Friday, and on Monday we had a meeting with our board that couldn't connect to the students because they didn't want to talk. So we started to act as a mediator, and the board said, okay, what do we need to do? And we were opportunistic. So we, together with colleagues that were lobbying for sustainability plans for years, there suddenly was momentum. So the board declared ecological crisis, committed to sustainability in education, did a number of things, among which a cross-campus dialogue with all the schools on the future of the disciplines. So we're now in the process. We have 3 cross-school dialogues, one on working with fossil industries, one on sustainability of operations at campus, and then we have a third one synthesizing all the outcomes of all the school dialogues that have roundtable conversations about the future of the disciplines in light of the ecological crisis. So we took it basically as an opportunity, and the students participate now in these dialogues to form a transformative agenda for the university.
Fantastic, great question, Andrea. And we're going to end the session for this morning here. We've got some morning tea in the atrium outside for about 15 minutes, and then we'll welcome you all back for a more interactive session after the morning tea. And thank you, Derk and Lee, for some excellent comments and presentations. I think that really set us up in an excellent way. Thank you very much.